All right, guys. Good morning or good afternoon, depending how you're watching this. Um, Sorry I couldn't be there with you today. I trust that you are all behaving like perfect little angels. Um, we're going to pick up here, and I won't take the whole class period. I'm not going to, or I hope not. Um, we are going to pick up with immigration, kind of where we left off last time. Um, we talked about Ellis Island and Angel Island being the two main ports that immigrants came through. Ellis Island being European immigrants, and Angel Island being Asian immigrants. And we talked about the process of how they get in the country, but now we're going to talk about what happened after. Uh, After they've passed inspection and are given the ability to move into the U.S. Many of them are obviously going to start moving to the cities, the big cities, because that's where the work is going to be made available. And other than religious or political freedom, finding a job is one of the biggest uh, draws to coming to the U.S. So obviously that's going to play a huge role in where they end up settling. So the biggest cities here being New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago, and on the West Coast, San Francisco and Los Angeles. Um, no surprise, but today those cities have a large um, ethnic makeup of immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Um, and kind of another reason for that is after a couple years of immigrants flooding into these cities, many of them move together or kind of congregate in the same parts of town. You know, you're more in a new country and a new culture out of your element. You're likely to go somewhere where you feel a little more comfortable and where you are surrounded by people such as yourself to help ease that transition. So many of these people would come to the same relative location um, where they're around similar and like-minded people. You know the saying, birds of a feather flock together. So that creates these little pockets in these cities where certain ethnic groups are abundant. So parts of certain cities being predominantly um, the same nationality. Uh, so it creates these places like Chinatown, and gosh, I don't know. I feel dumb. I don't know if Chinatown was in LA or in San Francisco, but it was a place where a lot of Chinese immigrants ended up moving to and really turning the culture into a Chinese style culture. All these Chinese restaurants and businesses. Um, for a couple blocks, it feels very authentically Chinese. Or places in New York had a lot of Italian immigrants. And today we see a large Italian influence in New York City, specifically in certain boroughs and in certain neighborhoods like Little Italy or La Villita, which is the little village. Pilsen was a German settlement um, where a high number of German immigrants settled in Chicago. Um, there's also Pilsen in Kansas. Uh, really, really tiny. It like 100 people. The city in Kansas is actually it's more Czech than German, but it originally modern day Czech Republic is in the former Bohemia, which is filled with a lot of German people as well. Anyway, now I'm just rambling on. Humboldt Park is also in Chicago, and Humboldt Park is an interesting place. It originally began as a Chinese borough. Like there's a lot of Asian immigrants there, mostly Chinese. Then sometime in the 70s or 80s, for some reason, um, the Chinese started moving out, and moving in were Hispanic immigrants. And today, Humboldt Park has like 70 or 80% of its population is of Hispanic immigrants or descendants of Hispanic immigrants. And again, it's because they go where they know people. So, and there's examples in small town. There's examples of that in Kansas. Um, we'll talk more about it in World War One, but like Hayes, Kansas, was founded as a German settlement. Um, Lindsberg was founded as a Swedish settlement. Um, a lot. We talk about the urbanization in this chapter, and then definitely more people moved to the cities, but there are still a lot of European or Asian farmers that then moved to the U.S. to specifically farm and live in rural areas. So moving on, um, immigrants specifically from Mexico tripled between 1910 and 1930. Mexico had been going through a lot of government overturn in this time. And when the Depression hits worldwide, many escaped the US thinking that it would be safe from it. Now, they eventually learned that it wasn't. But this is a time of huge influx of Mexican immigrants. In the last probably 40 years, we've seen, I wouldn't say a downturn of Mexican immigration, more like a stabilizing. We probably have a very similar number of Mexican immigrants coming in today as we did in the past, but we've seen a huge spike in immigrants from other Latin American countries, Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, even into South America, like Colombia and Venezuela. So we're still getting plenty of immigrants from Latin America. They're just not all coming. They're not coming directly or from Mexico specifically. So they referred to El Paso, Texas, as the Mexican Ellis Island, because that was the crossing point, or the border crossing point, where many of them came to. And I don't know much about the conditions of the estate in El Paso as compared to Ellis Island or Angel Island, but I can imagine it probably wasn't of the most pristine condition. And if you were to go to El Paso today, it has a very high percentage of Hispanic people living in it, as well as a lot of Western Texas. Now, some of them become permanent U.S. citizens, and others didn't. And if you're not becoming a U.S. citizen, there's a couple different things that you can do. Some would be classified as illegal, having not gone through the necessary um, paperwork or hoops to jump through, and would be undocumented. But those aren't the only two options in being either a U.S. citizen or being an undocumented illegal immigrant. Some actually become temporary inhabitants of the U.S. I don't know what the technical term would be, but basically they just get a work visa. They come here. It's kind of like signing a contract for like 2 or 3 years, and they're there to work. And every 3 or 5 years, they have to go back to Mexico and like reapply for their work visa. And that may be an outdated explanation. My knowledge of it comes purely from growing up on a dairy farm that employed many immigrants from Mexico. And like 20 years ago, there's probably about 10 workers on a farm that employed probably 12 or 13 total people. Probably 10 of them were immigrants from Mexico. And this is a total estimate, but 20 years ago, probably at least half of them, so at least like 5 of the 10 were there undocumented, thus illegally. And then there's maybe one that was in the process of becoming a permanent citizen, while the other 3 or 4 were there on work visa. The ones that were there on visa didn't, well, really, if you were becoming or wanted to become a permanent U.S. citizen, then they brought their entire family. These dairy workers, they brought their entire family. They're going to move there permanently. That was going to be their new home. The undocumented workers and the workers on a work permit on a visa, they mostly came alone, or came like with their brother that was also going to work, and left their family at home in Mexico, and they worked 365 days a year, every day, all day, every day, and sent probably 3/4 of their paycheck back home to their family, and kept just enough, for food and all that. Because the owner of the dairy did pay for their living. He paid their rent so that they could work here and so that they could send more money back home. And then those on visa every couple years would have to go back for like a couple weeks, get the paperwork done, and then they'd return to work. So yeah, that was just my experience with it. I knew guys that worked there for a couple weeks. I knew guys that worked there all throughout my childhood and up through today. There's one guy that I remember working there back in like the year 2000, when I would have been like 6 years old, and he's still working there. Now, he was one that he moved here permanently. Most of the guys that were here on visa or here illegally, they didn't stay, at least at the dairy. They didn't stay working there for more than a couple of years. There were some exceptions, but that was typically the common route that they took. So a question to keep in mind, you don't have to write this down, although it probably wouldn't be a terrible idea, because there's a distinct possibility that this may be a short answer question on the test. How do you think the native I need to change that question. I'm just not realizing that. That's a really poorly worded question. Because when I say native, what I usually mean is like Native Americans, the indigenous people. But in this question, I meant it as in the white people that were already living here. which are not native at all, they were also at one time immigrants or descendants of one time immigrants. So I'm just thinking out loud. Let me go ahead and rephrase that on the fly. How do you think the white people that were already living in America, that consider themselves Americans, how do you think they reacted to the new immigrants? You know, um, always had in this country, we've always had a fear, I guess you could say, of immigrants of all kinds. And it's not necessarily racially based, because a lot of times they didn't like the European immigrants either. The difference here is when you have a prejudice against someone, a disliking of someone for a reason that they can't control. Often it's a snap reaction or snap decision, and we often make those just by someone's appearance or just by looking at them. If you look at an immigrant from Serbia or from Italy, if you just look at them, if you didn't know their name and you hadn't heard them talk, you probably don't know they're an immigrant, because they're white. So, your prejudice doesn't come out at that time. Whereas an immigrant from Latin America or from Asia, they look different. And so that prejudice can come out in a snap decision, regardless of if you've ever talked to them, heard an accent, or heard their name. So, that prejudice is able to show to some people more than others. And what do they fear specifically about immigration? Like today, a lot of it's based around the whole like employment issue, the whole took your jobs fear, and a little bit of like national safety. They consider it, with extremists of coming from certain countries. That's definitely a way more modern style of thinking. But back at this time that we're learning about, it actually had more to do with governing style, because many of these immigrants, specifically from Europe, are coming from countries that are going through a government transition, and a lot of reading and learning is taking place in a lot of these places. So these people get new ideas, and basically the biggest problem this time was quite a few people immigrating from Italy to the U.S. were what's known as anarchists, where they don't believe in organized government at all. And so, because that was something we didn't really know and didn't understand, we took them as a threat and didn't like it. This is kind of also a time when communism starts to rear its head, and the Communist Manifesto was written by a German who was actually exiled into England, but it makes its rounds throughout Europe, but it doesn't really hit anything until it is read by the Bolsheviks in Russia in the 1900s. So that's not fully applicable here, but just another example of the mindset of some immigrants that are looking for new political ideas and freedom. So these immigrants take whatever jobs they can find, because that's their, well, not all, but as a general population, because that's what they're here for. They are here to find work. They are here to make money and to support themselves and a family. So they can't afford to be too picky. as I grew up witnessing. They wanted to get a job, um, regardless of skilled labor, menial labor, anything that could pay the bills. And often these jobs don't pay very much. Working conditions are not a concern. I mean, nowadays it's much better, obviously, because of unions and worker laws. But back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there wasn't much of a thought of safe working conditions or fair pay or decent hours. Once the light bulb's invented, you got people working 18, 16, 18 hours, 20 hours a day, because now the shop can stay open through the night. And a lot of the jobs these people took were sweatshops. Sweatshops are aptly named. They're hot, crowded, often dirty, filled with varmint and possibly even diseases. Add in the fact that these workers often put in long days, didn't get paid very much, and didn't have many rights as a worker. And a byproduct of this is what I call an oversaturation of labor. So what I mean by that is, think of supply and demand, how those two things coexist and counteract each other. Supply and demand refers to anything from supply and demand of a good or a product, but it also applies to labor. So in this case, I'm talking about labor. And when the supply of labor, meaning the number of eligible workers, of eligible employees, when that number is high, and the demand of labor, meaning jobs available, when that number is low, you have a problem for the workers. That means wages, what they get paid, is going to be low. Because if I'm an owner of a factory and I got a spot for 20 workers, but I've got 100 people applying, I can offer you $5 an hour. And if you can't live on $5 an hour, then that's fine. I'm going to go find one of these other 100 applicants that can. So you can kind of work that against people. And on the flip side of that, when supply of labor is low, and if demand is moderate or high, then the power goes back to the workers. The wages will get higher because the employers are desperate for workers. During this time, it's not even the demand for labor is low. Demand for labor is plenty high because we got all these new factories sprouting up out of the ground. But the supply of labor was just so high. There were so many people moving in at such a fast rate that wages couldn't grow. They couldn't expand. So while factories and businesses are making so much money, it's not really going into workers' wages. And these workers, before working laws or before labor laws were instituted, these sweatshops were filled with immigrants, and they're filled with women and children, and anybody or any family that was desperate for money and stability would work in these conditions regardless of how terrible they were, because they needed to. So here are some images of sweatshops. It's just menial labor. It's just doing the same thing over and over again, usually working with heavy machinery or at least possibly hazardous machinery. If you're not careful or if you're not well trained, you can really get yourself into trouble. Oftentimes women worked in like textile mills and were sewing things, and if you remember last year in world history, we talked about kids working in factories and the job of a scavenger, which was specific to the cotton industry, when every once in a while you get a bunch of loose cotton just kind of stuffed there in a corner that wasn't getting processed, and so they'd have a child crawl back there because it was only small enough to fit, and then they disappear back there trying to round things up, and someone will come up not knowing there's a child in there, turn on the machine and kill the child. And no settlement, no paycheck or nothing. It wasn't, I don't think it was that bad in the US. That was more of a early 1800s European issue, but I'm sure accidents like that probably happen anywhere in this time. So this, you don't have to write, it's more for narrative purposes, but many immigrants, you take the bad with the good. I just explained how poor the conditions were, and the woes of traveling across an ocean with the possibility of maybe not even being allowed to stay in the country. Despite that, many of these new Americans were improved because of life in the Industrial Revolution. Not everybody gets rich, but just so many jobs being available and so many new products that are being mass produced. Standard of living does improve for most people. I'm not going to say everybody because it's impossible for something to benefit or harm everybody. There's always going to be a beneficiary, and there's always going to be someone hurt from it. But a majority of people really did benefit during this time, even though it was unbalanced, unequal as far as the growth of wealth. So, when you compare the lives of immigrants before and after the Industrial Revolution, it's more stable work. It's work that puts you in a city where you have a chance of being surrounded by people similar to yourself, and that transition is not so scary or lonely. And you're not relying purely on farming, and farming's great. We need farmers for our species survival, but any farmer themselves will tell you it's a difficult line of work. It's a difficult way to make a living just because there's so many variables that you don't have control over. And if you're an immigrant on land you don't really know, surrounded by markets, economic markets and businesses that you don't know, then it's difficult. But this era gives people jobs, and a standard of living that at the worst still had to be an improvement over the war-torn lives that they left in Europe, or the politically um, disadvantaged lives they were living back in their homelands. So I think we'll stop there for today. The study guide is posted on Classroom. I know we're not finished with the notes, but we're pretty close to the end, so you should be able to do quite a bit of it. And then tomorrow I'll have another quick lecture, and we'll hopefully get a little closer to finishing the notes. And then once I finish that, you will work on the study guide again going into the weekend. So thank you, and be on your best behavior. Please have a terrific day.